From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
I knew that I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghettos without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government.
50 years ago this week, Martin Luther King Jr. gave a groundbreaking speech at Riverside Church, coming out against the war in Vietnam. Exactly a year later, King would be assassinated in Memphis. We'll hear Dr. King in his own words and speak to the Reverend William Barber about King's anti-war message and what it means today. Plus, we go to North Carolina.
Today, we repealed House Bill 2, and we began to end discrimination in North Carolina.
The anti-trans law HB 2 may no longer be on the books in North Carolina, but many groups are calling for a boycott of the state to continue. We'll find out why. Plus, Donald Trump welcomes Egyptian dictator General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi to the White House as thousands of Egyptian activists remain locked up in prison. We'll speak with Sharif Abdel-Quddus in Cairo.
There's very little space for any kind of dissent, any kind of opposition right now in Egypt. You risk years in prison, you risk your life.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. NBC News is reporting the Senate Intelligence Committee has rejected former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn's request for immunity in exchange for testimony in the ongoing investigation into whether the Trump campaign colluded with Russia to influence the 2016 election. On Friday, White House spokesperson Sean Spicer said the White House wants Flynn to testify.
So does the president think that Mike Flynn is guilty of a crime?
I think he believes that Mike Flynn should go testify. He thinks that he should go up there and do what he has to do to get the story out.
With or without immunity?
Well, I mean, that's up to him and his lawyer to decide. I'm not going to give Mike Flynn or anyone else legal advice from the podium, but I will tell you that the president's view is he should go up there, he should testify.
A similar investigation by the House Intelligence Committee remains stalled as the ranking Democrat on the committee, California Congressmember Adam Schiff, accused committee chair Devin Nunes of attempting to distract the public from the ongoing investigation. On Friday, Schiff viewed the classified intelligence documents that were secretly shown to Nunes on the grounds of the White House by two White House officials in March, only one day before Nunes traveled back to the White House to supposedly brief the president about the documents the president's own staff had given him. Nunes, who is a member of Trump's transition team, say the documents indicated Trump or his associates might have been incidentally swept up in surveillance carried out by American spy agencies as they conducted foreign surveillance. After viewing the documents a full 10 days after Nunes viewed them, Schiff criticized Nunes for refusing to share them with the full committee. Nunes is facing increasing calls to recuse himself from the investigation or step down as chair of the Intelligence Committee altogether. On Friday, hundreds of protesters confronted Nunes outside a speaking event in his home district of Fresno, California. Meanwhile, the New York Times reports Flynn failed to disclose payments from Russian-linked companies on one of two financial disclosure forms released Saturday by the White House. President Trump dodged questions from a reporter about Michael Flynn by fleeing the Oval Office Friday afternoon during what was supposed to be a signing ceremony of two executive orders on trade.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Will you try to tell the Justice Department to grant immunity to Michael Flynn? Sir, will you try to President? Is that your intention, Mr. President?
Thank you, President.
Is that your intention, Mr. President? Is that your intention?
As President Trump departed, Vice President Mike Pence gathered up the unsigned papers. Trump later signed the orders in private, away from reporters. The two orders establish a commission to study the causes of U.S. trade deficits and tighten laws that restrict foreign manufacturers from undercutting the prices of U.S. goods. More financial disclosure forms released by the White House Friday night showed that President Trump's son-in-law and senior advisor, Jared Kushner, and Trump's daughter, Ivanka, will continue to receive the financial benefits of a vast real estate empire worth up to $740 million, despite the two now holding official roles in the administration. President Trump is to meet with Egyptian dictator General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi at the White House today, even as Sisi faces widespread criticism for human rights abuses in Egypt. Human rights organizations say Sisi and his security forces have arrested tens of thousands of Egyptians and have committed torture, forced disappearances, and extrajudicial killings. The Trump administration has indicated it will not bring up the human rights abuses during today's meetings. We'll go to Cairo for more on Egypt with Democracy Now! Correspondent Sharif Abdel-Qaddous later in the broadcast. President Trump will be meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping on Thursday at his Florida resort Mar-a-Lago, even though the meetings are unlikely to include any tee time on Trump's Mar-a-Lago golf course. Xi has closed over 100 golf courses across China, where the Communist Party officially bans its members by playing the game, Xi calling it a millionaire's game. The Trump administration is currently not required to publish the visitor logs for meetings at private resorts, including Mar-a-Lago, although Democratic lawmakers have introduced a new piece of legislation, the Mar-a-Lago Act, that would force him to do so. In an interview with the Financial Times published Sunday, Trump warned he would be willing to take unilateral action against North Korea over its nuclear weapons program. Trump said, quote, "If China is not going to solve North Korea, we will." President Trump will host Jordan's King Abdullah on Wednesday, the day before hosting the meeting with Chinese President Xi. Trump's upcoming meeting with President Xi comes as China is calling on the U.S. not to break its 2015 Paris Accord pledges. China is now surging ahead of the United States in terms of tackling climate change and promoting renewable energy after Trump signed an executive order dismantling a slew of climate rules last week. Speaking Sunday on Fox News, Environmental Protection Agency Director Scott Pruitt said the government should not promote renewables over fossil fuels.
We shouldn't have this commitment by the U.S. government to say that fossil fuels are bad, renewables are good. The U.S. EPA and the U.S. government should not pick winners and losers, Chris. And that's what's happened in the last several years.
Last week, EPA Director Scott Pruitt also rejected an effort to ban a farming insecticide, even though scientists have concluded the Dow chemical product leads to a range of learning and memory impairments in farm workers and their children. A federal judge in Kentucky ruled a lawsuit can proceed that accuses President Trump of inciting violence against protesters at a campaign rally in March 2016 in Louisville. 3 anti-Trump activists say they were shoved and punched by Trump supporters after Trump repeatedly said, "Get him out of here." The New York Times is reporting Fox News and its talk show star Bill O'Reilly have combined paid 5 women up to $13 million to settle sexual harassment claims against O'Reilly. The women accuse O'Reilly of making unwanted sexual comments, kissing or touching them without their consent, and retaliating against them professionally when they rejected his advances. The revelations come after the former chair of Fox, Roger Ailes, was ousted after more than 20 women accused him of sexual harassment. Demonstrators gathered in cities nationwide Saturday to protest against Trump's Supreme Court Justice nominee Neil Gorsuch. This is Candace Bontherote of the National LGBTQ Task Force speaking at a protest outside the Supreme Court building in Washington, D.C.
And we are here to show that we object and we resist. We know that Judge Gorsuch has ruled terribly for women's reproductive rights and the rights of all people who can become pregnant, including trans folks and gender nonconforming folks who can also become pregnant.
The Senate Judiciary Committee is expected to vote today on whether to forward Gorsuch's nomination to the floor, which is expected to be voted on Friday. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer has vowed Democrats will filibuster the vote. President Trump's son-in-law and senior advisor Jared Kushner visited Iraq over the weekend amidst the ongoing U.S. and Iraqi military's campaign to retake Mosul from ISIS. The monitoring group Air Wars says dozens of civilians were reportedly killed or wounded by airstrikes and shelling on Friday. The group also reports the U.S. launched 6 more airstrikes on Mosul over the weekend. U.S.-led coalition airstrikes in Mosul have killed hundreds of civilians in recent months, including a single strike on March 17th that may have killed up to 200 civilians. This is Ali Ibrahim, a resident of West Mosul.
We went away after the airstrikes. The airstrikes struck every building on the block, destroying it. There were no Islamic State fighters. A whole block destroyed from top to bottom by coalition planes.
To see extended conversations about Mosul, you can go to DemocracyNow.org. The United Nations says at least 5 million Syrians have now fled Syria amidst the ongoing 6-year conflict, which began as a democratic uprising against Syrian President Bashar al-Assad in 2011. Another 13.5 million Syrians have been displaced inside the country. On Friday, the White House said the U.S. is abandoning efforts to pressure Assad to relinquish power.
Well, I think with respect to Assad, I mean, there is a political reality that we have to accept in terms of where we are right now. We lost a lot of opportunity the last administration with respect to Assad.
Monitoring groups say Assad's government is responsible for the vast majority of civilian deaths in the ongoing war. Physicians for Human Rights says at least 2 hospitals have been bombed in the last week near the northwest city of Hama, amid fighting between anti-government rebels and Assad's forces backed by Russian airstrikes. Syrian opposition chief negotiator Nasser al-Hariri slammed Assad's government at peace talks in Geneva.
The regime is still refusing to discuss political transition, and they are discussing their empty rhetoric about countering terrorism, although they are attracting terrorism to the region. They used chemical weapons against the people.
In Paraguay, 25-year-old activist Rodrigo Quintana was shot and killed by police Friday night amidst widespread protests in the capital against a secret Senate vote to remove presidential term limits. Quintana was killed when riot police stormed the headquarters of the Liberal Opposition Party and opened fire with rubber bullets. His killing sparked protests over the weekend and the ouster of 2 top officials. In Ecuador, ruling party candidate Lenin Moreno appears to have narrowly beaten the right-wing former banker Guillermo Lasso in Sunday's presidential runoff vote. With 94% of the votes counted, Moreno, who served as vice president to outgoing President Rafael Correa, is leading with 51% of the vote. Lasso had said he would throw WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange out of the Ecuadorian embassy in London if elected. In Colombia, more than 230 people have died in mudslides and an avalanche after the city of Mocoa received as much rainfall in one night as it usually receives in half the month of March. Colombian President Juan Manuel Santos pinned the disaster on climate change. Meanwhile, nearly a dozen people are feared to be dead on the Indonesian island of Java after torrential rain triggered a landslide there. And in Australia, 3 people have been killed and tens of thousands displaced by floodwaters after a cyclone swept across the island's east coast. El Salvador has become the first country in the world to ban metal mining nationwide after lawmakers voted overwhelmingly to pass the measure last week. The ban comes after more than a decade of organizing against a proposed Canadian gold mine called El Dorado. Several anti-mining activists were killed during the struggle, which grew into a nationwide movement to prohibit metal mining across El Salvador. An imprisoned journalist and former Black Panther Mumia Abu-Jamal will begin taking a new, fast-acting drug for hepatitis C this week after winning a legal victory in federal court. The treatment has a 90% cure rate. Pennsylvania prison officials say it can cost $50,000 per person and have sued in order to limit its use. Abu-Jamal's lawyers say the decision paves the way for thousands more prisoners to get treated. But his lawyers also noted Abu-Jamal got sicker while the case was under appeal and has since been diagnosed with cirrhosis of the liver. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. It's probably safe to say that many North Carolinians are thinking about the NCAA today. But that's not just because the University of North Carolina Tar Heels are facing off against Gonzaga in tonight's NCAA Men's Basketball Championship. It marks the 2nd straight year that UNC has made the tournament finals. But the road to the Final Four was a bit harder this year for the Tar Heels. Unlike many past years, UNC had to make it without playing any tournament games in its home state. That's because the NCAA pulled all regional games from the state to protest the North Carolina HB 2, which denied transgender people use of the bathroom, changing room, or locker room that matches their gender identity.
Well, last week, North Carolina lawmakers repealed the law, but the new law is also facing criticism, and the NCAA is now weighing whether tournament games should be allowed in the state again. Under the new law, transgender people will be able to use the bathroom matching their gender identity, it's believed. But municipal governments will be prohibited from enacting anti-discrimination ordinances through 2020. In addition, the law denies employment and housing protections to the LGBTQ community. Democratic Governor Roy Cooper signed the legislation Thursday while acknowledging its shortcomings.
This is not a perfect deal, and it is not my preferred solution. It stops short of many things we need to do as a state. In a perfect world, with a good General Assembly, we would have repealed House Bill 2 fully today and added full statewide protections for LGBT North Carolinians. Unfortunately, our supermajority Republican legislature will not pass these protections. But this is an important goal that I will keep fighting for. Now, House Bill 2 created a misguided, unworkable, and unnecessary requirement that individuals use the bathroom that match the gender on their birth certificate. Today's law immediately removes that restriction. It's gone.
Governor Roy Cooper's signature came on Thursday's deadline, set by the NCAA for the repeal of HB 2. The association said its governing board was reviewing the new law and would soon decide whether to extend the boycott of tournament games worth billions of dollars to North Carolina's economy.
Well, for more, we're joined by two guests. James Essex is director of the ACLU LGBT and HIV Project. In North Carolina, Chapel Hill, we're joined by Joaquin Carcano, who is a plaintiff in the ACLU lawsuit against North Carolina, a transgender man who works as a project coordinator at the Institute for Global Health and Infectious Disease at the University of North Carolina. We want to welcome you both to Democracy Now! James Essex, let's begin with you. It is very hard to understand what actually was passed and repealed on Friday. Please explain. Is HB 2 still in any way on the books?
Well, what happened was HB 2 was repealed, but it was replaced with something that does just about the same kind of terrible things to the LGBT community that HB 2 did. So let's take HB 2 in two parts. It did two major things. The first thing is that it barred cities and counties from having LGBT non-discrimination ordinances. That was a permanent ban. Now it's a ban through 2020. So there's a change, but not a big change. Certainly nothing on the ground now anytime soon. The piece of HB 2 that got much more attention nationwide, appropriately, was the anti-trans portion of HB 2, which said that trans people were barred from using the restrooms that matched their gender identity. Instead, they had to use restrooms that matched the gender marker on their birth certificate, regardless of whether they had managed to change that gender marker or not. That explicit bar on the use of restrooms by trans people has gone, but it's been replaced by nothing, and that nothing sounds like nothing, but it's actually enormously important. This new law, HB 142, says that it's only the state legislature that can regulate who gets access to what restrooms. Cities can't do that. School districts can't do that. Nobody else can do that. But then, of course, the legislature has said, we're not going to tell you what restrooms trans people can use. So the bar from HB 2 is gone, but it's replaced by a rule that school districts, state agencies, the University of North Carolina, state buildings can have no rule about where trans people or cisgender people use the restroom.
And what is that? What's the impact on that in pre-existing situations? For example, didn't the city of Charlotte have a non-discrimination provision previously that it then withdrew as a part of a compromise for this legislation? Or?
Exactly. So Charlotte had a non-discrimination ordinance that covered LGBT people and specifically addressed the restroom issue, question. In December, as part of an attempt to repeal HB 2, this Charlotte City Council repealed that ordinance. So Charlotte no longer has that ordinance, and there are no protections at the city level for trans people or LGBT people in Charlotte. And what this does
But now it's also prevented from reinstituting that, right?
Absolutely. So they can't fix it now. And permanently, this ban on any regulation by anybody in the state other than the state legislature about restrooms is permanent. And so it leaves people like Joaquin in a difficult situation. You can go to your supervisor at work and say, okay, what's the deal? Can I use the men's room or not? I read that state legislation to mean that the supervisor cannot provide an answer because that would be a policy. That's ridiculous.
Let's go to Joaquin Carcaño, a transgender activist in North Carolina. If you have a suit against North Carolina for HB 2, which has now been repealed, HB 142 has replaced it. Your thoughts?
You know, HB 142 is just a repackaged HB 2 under a different name. As James said, it's been replaced, but we still don't have any safety. We still don't have any protections, and we're still actively restricted from navigating our daily lives.
So how will it affect you? And talk about your activism and the activism that brought North Carolina to the point it's at right now, losing hundreds of millions of dollars because of HB 2 in place, and now everything that's happening with the NCAA, pulling the games from North Carolina, and now considering whether or not to consider the new bill, 142, as an adequate substitute.
The fight continues. You know, I think this was a tactic to sort of undermine our momentum and our fight that we've invested a lot in the past year to combat the damage of HB 2. But it still continues because the violent discrimination of this legislation it still exists in the state. And so we continue fighting. We continue to ask for boycotts of the state, for the NCAA to not return to North Carolina, and for the state and the nation to continue to see that North Carolina is actively discriminated against our community.
And what's your response to those legislators who you consider to be allies in this fight, who were supportive of the LGBT community and then ended up voting for this particular bill?
They sold us out. I mean, completely. There were empty promises that were made to us leading up into elections. We, gave a lot of support, and not just, the LGBT community, but our own allies and our friends, our family, our communities. We all really threw our support behind these legislators that said that they would protect us going forward, that they would fight for a complete repeal of HB 2, and that's been compromised. Our lives, our rights have been compromised, and we've been sold out.
Last year, Democracy Now! Spoke to Peyton McGarry, a student at University of North Carolina at Greensboro and a plaintiff in the federal lawsuit filed to challenge the new North Carolina law, HB 2 at the time. He told us his story, why he got involved in the case.
I am a 20-year-old student at UNCG in accounting and business. Give you a little bit of backstory. I grew up in a small town in North Carolina. At about the age of 15 or 16, I started feeling different. Something just felt a little bit off. I started coming out to my family, my friends, and seeing a therapist based on gender and all that good stuff at 17 years old, and started hormone replacement therapy at 18 years old. Sorry. And here we are. So it means a lot to me that this lawsuit is taking place just because of my own experiences with opposition to my gender. And I've experienced a lot of just distressing discrimination in North Carolina, and I can't believe that we're passing laws now that actually not only enable it, but in some cases require it.
So, Joaquin Carcaño, the lawsuit is actually named for you, Carcaño versus McGrory. Now, of course, the new governor, it'll change to versus Cooper. Can you tell us your story, how you came to be the named person in this lawsuit challenging the state of North Carolina?
Yeah, definitely. The ACLU and Lambda Legal had reached out to individuals at UNC once HB 2 was passed, and I had received some communication They were interested in talking to affected students and staff members at UNC, and I responded and just said, this is who I am. Let me know if I can be of any help. And the conversation went from there. But, you know, in regards to getting involved in this fight, I am a transgender male, a transgender Latino male. I'm from Texas, where similar violent discrimination and legislation is trying to be passed. But also, in my role at UNC, I serve the trans Latina community, and that is really, really important to me to be able to fight for my community on very many levels, but also offer some protection to the trans Latina community that I serve that face lots of discrimination and violence day in and day out. So this is not just about me personally, but about my broader community and who I serve in my personal life, my professional life, and being able to offer whatever kind of protection I can. And this was an opportunity to take on this fight.
And James Essex, what about the implication across the country for the continuing battle in North Carolina?
Well, I think at this point, all eyes are on the NCAA and to try and figure out what it is they do. Do they decide that the changes, the small changes in the law in North Carolina are enough to, you know, excuse the discrimination, and they're going to sign off on that and allow the state to once again host championships? Or are they going to stand firm and stand up for the principle that they stood up for at the middle of last year when they said, you know what, this is not acceptable? And the reason that all our eyes are on the NCAA is that there's a range of other states that have similar HB2-like bills that they're considering. Texas is prime among them. And I think if there's a sense that, oh, the business community doesn't care, that the sports community doesn't care about these laws, we're going to see more of these, and there's going to be more harm to LGBT people all over the country.
We want to thank you both for being with us. James Essex, director of the ACLU LGBT and HIV Project, and Joaquin Carcaño, speaking to us from Chapel Hill, transgender activist, student at University of North Carolina, plaintiff in the ACLU lawsuit. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. When we come back, we'll be joined by Reverend Barber to talk about other issues that were involved with HB2 and also this 50th anniversary of the speech Dr. King gave here at Riverside Church in Manhattan, speaking out against the war in Vietnam. Reverend Barber gave the sermon yesterday at Riverside Church. Stay with us.
Now one weary day I woke. My alarm said plug time's up. Filled my bath up with the water, gargled with my gargle cup. As I bathed, I felt a presence, and I'm sort of ticklish. I looked down and then around, and I heard, hi, I'm Mr. Fish. How do you do? As for me, I'm in tip-top shape today, 'cause my water's clean and no one's menu says fresh fish fillet. See, I look past all my worries, which is something you must do. Though you're fed up, throw your head up with this advice from me to you, and that's to tread water. As the day went unexplained, time was finding nothing fun. As I walked along the sidewalk, I heard, excuse me, plug one. From my soul, they lied, that is. I hollered, yes, are you talking to me? No alarming, he said, let me introduce myself. I'm Mr. Monkey. Mr. Monkey, I pledge you slap of 5. Now how does your problem meet? He said my bananas are at their ripest, but they all stand at 3 feet. My swinging hand is bandaged up. Could you help me with this chore? I brought him down to the native shop and brought him copies of the De La Store, which assisted well in his elevation. Now all bananas was at his grasp. He decided with this accomplished, he would put me onto the path. He told me to live by the inner sound, y'all, which would bring me health and showbiz. Then to use them, not abuse them, and remember the word that got me to him, and that is to tread water.
Tread Water by De La Soul. Happy birthday, Prince Paul. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Last week, North Carolina lawmakers repealed the anti-trans law HB2, but the new law is also facing criticism, and the NCAA is now weighing whether tournament games should be allowed in the state again. Under the new law, transgender people will be able to use the bathroom matching their gender identity, but municipal governments will be prohibited from enacting anti-discrimination ordinances through 2020. In addition, the law denies employment and housing protections to the LGBTQ community.
To talk more about the law, we're joined by Reverend Dr. William Barber, President and Senior Lecturer of Repairers of the Breach, and also the President of the NAACP of North Carolina. Reverend Barber, before we talk about this seminal week, the anniversary of Dr. King's anti-war speech, 50th anniversary here in New York, we wanted to get your take on what's taken place right now in North Carolina with the repeal, kind of HB 2 and this new law put into place, HB 142.
Well, thank you so much, Amy, and good morning also, Juan. Part of what we hope is that the nation will really understand how we got here. First of all, this HB 2 bill was first passed by an all-white, extreme Republican Jim Crow caucus. And I want to say it just that clearly, led by Senate Leader Phil Berger and House Leader Tim Moore in North Carolina. Secondly, it was passed as an election ploy, just like the attempt in North Carolina some years ago to do the marriage amendment. It was passed to be a wedge issue during the election. Now, this is the same legislature, Amy, that has 15 times passed bills that have been found unconstitutional. This is the same legislature, the all-white Republican caucus, that passed the worst voter discrimination laws in the country and the worst redistricting laws since the 19th century, which have both been found unconstitutional. Same legislature that denied Medicaid expansion in North Carolina. So people need to understand that this is a pattern. And the HB 2 law, we never referred to it as a bathroom law because that was a ploy. The goal was to split the transgender community off. This bill is an anti-worker bill. It was an anti-worker bill. It was an anti-access to the court bill for even heterosexuals because since 1985, citizens of North Carolina could bring employment discrimination cases to the state courts. HB 2 removed that. It took away the ability of local municipalities to raise wages, and it was an anti-transgender bill. And it's important for us to talk about it in that way, first to understand the history of the bill itself. Now, the so-called repeal is not a repeal. It's a Trojan horse. It's a capitulation. It puts a moratorium on equal rights. It says for 3.5 years, municipalities cannot pass non-discrimination laws, cannot pass living wage laws. And then after 3.5 years, certain laws can only be passed if the legislature gives permission or an exemption to that municipality or that city or county. That is a violation of equal protection under the law, and it is not a compromise, and it is not a repeal. It is a capitulation. It is a Trojan horse.
Now, Reverend Barber, what about this issue of the prominent role the NAACP has taken in this issue? And do you think what the civil rights community can do to continue to keep the pressure on the NAACP, on the NCAA, to be able to keep the pressure on North Carolina?
Yeah, well, the NCAA and other groups as well. First thing, we have to frame this right. I think progressives have got to be real careful of using the language of the people who started this. See, they wanted us to call it a bathroom bill so that we did not look at how it was an interlocking of injustices in that bill that can actually bring communities together. So one of the things we have said, our role in the NAACP is to look at the bill in its totality. It is a triune discriminatory bill. It is not just one community. They wanted to highlight that. We should highlight the fact it's anti-worker, anti-transgender, anti-gay, and anti-access to the court. Even disabled veterans and heterosexuals were hurt by HB 2. Secondly, the NAACP right now has a major task force where we are examining whether or not we will call for a full escalation and boycott of North Carolina, but not just because of HB 2 or this non-repeal, but also because this same legislature attempted to strip power from the incoming governor, which is one of the things that confuses us, is why would the current governor sign off on this when we just fought a battle and we're fighting a battle of the same legislature trying to strip power from him? We're saying that because this state legislature has refused to follow the court in redrawing our district lines and having special elections because we have an unconstitutionally constituted legislature, because of the ways they've tried to engage in legislative coup d'etat, because of the way they have tried to stack the courts, and because of the implications of HB2 and this false repeal. We are considering a full-blown boycott, and we've already basically said we would not put forth bringing our own national convention to North Carolina. You know, Amy and Juan, this is very serious because when we start saying that you can put a moratorium on civil rights, that should cause every North Carolinian outrage and concern. When we start saying that we're going to give to a state legislature the power to say yes or no to local municipalities who want to engage in non-discrimination laws, who want to increase their living wages for their citizens, that should trouble us all. So we should see this as a civil rights issue, as a moral issue, as a gay issue, as a workers' rights issue, as a bad piece of legislation that all people should be against.
Well, Reverend Barber, I want to turn now to the words of Dr. Martin Luther King. Tuesday marks the 50th anniversary of King's groundbreaking speech against the Vietnam War at New York City's Riverside Church. He delivered the speech on April 4th, 1967, a year to the day before he was murdered. This is part of what he said.
I speak as a child of God and brother to the suffering poor of Vietnam. I speak for those whose land is being laid waste, whose homes are being destroyed, whose culture is being subverted. I speak for the poor of America, who are paying the double price of smashed hopes at home and death and corruption in Vietnam. I speak as a citizen of the world, for the world as it stands aghast at the path we have taken. I speak as one who loves America, to the leaders of our own nation. The great initiative in this war is ours. The initiative to stop it must be ours.
The Reverend Martin Luther King went on to call the United States the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today.
As I have walked among the desperate, rejected, and angry young men, I have told them that Molotov cocktails and rifles would not solve their problems. I have tried to offer them my deepest compassion while maintaining my conviction that social change comes most meaningfully through nonviolent action. But they ask, and rightly so, what about Vietnam? They ask if our own nation wasn't using massive doses of violence to solve its problems, to bring about the changes it wanted. Their questions hit home, and I knew that I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghettos without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government.
Dr. Martin Luther King speaking at Riverside Church April 4th, 1967. To talk more about the speech, we're still joined by the Reverend Dr. William Barber, President and Senior Lecturer of Repairers of the Breach. He delivered a sermon at New York's Riverside Church on Sunday commemorating this 50th anniversary of Dr. King's Beyond Vietnam speech. The sermon Reverend Barber delivered was titled, "When Silence is Not an Option." Can you talk about the significance of what Dr. King said and when he said it, even his inner circle, Reverend Barber, telling him, don't speak against the war in Vietnam. You have the most powerful person on earth, the President of the United States, Lyndon Johnson, wrapped around your finger. You got the Civil Rights Act passed, the Voting Rights Act. This is not your war. But King said no, and he gave this speech. Dr. Barber.
Yeah, he gave this speech, I would say a prophetic sermon, at Riverside, and was killed exactly 1 year later. But Dr. King was very clear that you can never separate the isms, the triune isms of racism, materialism or classism, and militarism. And he was very clear about that. He knew that the prophetic role of the preacher, a religious leader or moral leader, is to challenge, if you will, the soul and the heart of the nation. If you listen to his voice and his words, he was very clear. Vincent Harding, who helped him draft that particular speech, and some say that something like 150 newspapers wrote articles against him the next week. Even civil rights organizations passed resolutions against him. Unions did the same thing, not all, but some. I know that was one place the Nation magazine stuck with him, but many pulled away, his own staff. But he understood as a moral leader that we had to challenge. Now the question is, and the reason we're at the press club today is because Repairs of the Breach and the Kairos Center from Union, we are convening and launching The Souls of Poor Folk, Auditing America 50 years after the Poor People's Campaign challenged racism, materialism, poverty, and our national morality. Because, you know, after that speech, he went into the Poor People's Campaign. And the question, Amy and Juan, for the country today is, where are we on these same issues? Where are we really on racism when we see 22 states in this country passing systemic race-based voter suppression laws, and we have less voting rights protection today than we had in 1965, the gutting of the Voting Rights Act? Where are we when we have our second highest level of child poverty, when we have exorbitant and extreme inequalities when it comes to wages? Where are we when we don't even hardly use the word poor in our public and political conversations? Where are we when we, just a few weeks ago, saw an out-of-control military strike kill 200 innocent citizens, and some 400,000 citizens were killed during the Iraq war that we should have never gone into? Where are we when we're talking about expanding an already bloated military budget and spending money, some $54 billion, that if we use that same money in a modern-day war against poverty and a modern call for health care and education, we could do so much more? Where are we when we just saw our Congress debate on a fundamental human rights issue, health care, and argue that it was wrong to provide people health care, and wanting to engage in the worst attacks on the poor that we've seen since the war on poverty? So we need a very serious audit, but also we need an action. And many of us are saying we can't just remember Dr. King's speech or his actions. So together, we've also called for the National Moral Revival, Poor People, Poor Children a campaign to start in 2018, beginning with this audit, but the audit then leading to action. And the audit is going to be chaired by Reverend Dr. Forbes, the former past emeritus of Riverside, and Shelley Gupta Barnes, who's a lawyer and an economist, and Dr. Tim Tyson, who's a renowned historian. And we're bringing economists and theologians and political scientists and poor people around the table to say not just how we remember, but how do we re-engage and reinstitute the Poor People's Campaign with all of its trimmings, including civil disobedience from the state up and even in the capital of this country, Washington, D.C.
And Reverend, I wanted to ask you, you're going to be moving on from where you are in D.C. now later in the week, going to Memphis, where Dr. King was assassinated a year after that speech at Riverside Church, where he had gone there to support the sanitation workers who were on strike in Memphis. And you're going to be going there to deal with the issue of $15 an hour. Could you talk about that as well?
Right. Well, and it's a powerful coming together. You know, Dr. King saw, that's one of the reasons that people feared him, because he was bringing together the anti-war movement, the concerns about poverty, and the civil rights movement. And on tomorrow, we will be there first at the museum to train clergy and others in this modern-day need for a Poor People's Campaign and a moral revival. But then later, we'll join with the Fight for 15, Black Lives Matter, Repair, and Moral Revival coming together, because even in Memphis today, even in the South today, you know, the poorest states are still in the South, 10 of 12 poorest states. The same states that pass voter suppression laws also do not have living wages, many of them have denied Medicaid expansion, and have the highest rates of poverty. And we're going to fight for 15 in that city, as those workers are demanding $15 an hour in that city and are challenging the structures there legally and otherwise. So yes, he fought in yesteryear, but we must not merely remember yesteryear, we must bring it alive today. And remember, 50 years later, we still do not have a living wage. And one of the things Dr. King wanted, he said you can give people housing and you can do different things, but he called that piecemeal in his book, Where Do We Go From Here? He wanted the government to provide a living wage, because he understood it was government policies that created slavery, that created income disparity. And he knew that people needed a living wage and that wars and racism were hindering us from doing the right thing economically. So that's why we're going to lead a march on tomorrow in Memphis around some of these same issues that we have to decide. We're not going to merely glorify and glamorize the past and say what Dr. King did then. His speech at Riverside raises what are we going to do with what he said today? That's the question that we must deal with.
Reverend Dr. William Barber, thanks so much for being with us, President and Senior Lecturer of Repairers of the Breach and President of the North Carolina NAACP. He's speaking to us from the National Press Club in Washington before he goes to Memphis, where he and others will be holding a news conference today at 9 a.m. This is Democracy Now! Tomorrow, Noam Chomsky will be our guest for the hour. We'll also talk to him about Dr. King's historic speech. But when we come back, we go to Cairo, Egypt, to speak with Sharif Abdel-Qaddous. The Egyptian president, Sisi, is in Washington to meet with President Trump today. Stay with us.
Exit light into night. Take my hand. We're off to Never, Never Land. Something's wrong, shut the light. Heavy thoughts tonight, and they are no Snow White. Dreams of war, dreams of lies, dreams of dragons, fire, and of things that bite. Sleep with one eye open, gripping your pillow tight. Exit light.
Enter Sandman, performed by Shell. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, President Donald Trump is scheduled to welcome Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi to the White House today. Sisi, a former military general, is the first Egyptian president to visit the White House since Egypt's 2011 revolution. He rose to power in 2013 through a military coup, overthrowing Egypt's first freely elected president, Mohamed Morsi. The Trump administration has already indicated it will not publicly address Egypt's grave human rights record during today's meeting. Sarah Morgan of Human Rights Watch said, quote, inviting al-Sisi for an official visit to Washington as tens of thousands of Egyptians rot in jail and when torture is again the order of the day is a strange way to build a strategic relationship.
President Trump has called Sisi a fantastic guy after meeting him on the sidelines at the United Nations General Assembly in New York last year. And al-Sisi was reportedly the first world leader to congratulate Trump on winning the presidency in November in a phone call. Al-Sisi's meeting with Trump comes shortly after an Egyptian court freed Hosni Mubarak from prison 6 years after the former dictator led a crackdown on protests that killed hundreds of people opposed to his 30-year rule. The 88-year-old Mubarak left a military hospital in southern Cairo, returned to his home in the city's northern suburbs. Well, for more, we go to Cairo, Egypt, where we're joined by Sharif Abdel-Qaddous, Democracy Now's correspondent in Cairo, a Nation Institute fellow. Sharif, welcome back to Democracy Now! Can you talk about the significance of the meeting today in the White House between Egyptian President Sisi and President Trump?
Well, I think first it's important to note, Sisi has presided over the worst wave of repression in Egypt's modern history. As you mentioned, tens of thousands of opposition supporters have been imprisoned. Many people have gone into exile. Torture, extrajudicial killing, forced disappearances are rampant. Journalists have been prosecuted and sentenced. Draconian laws limiting freedom of expression, freedom of assembly are ruthlessly enforced. And the airwaves have been purged of all dissident voices, and there's an unprecedented crackdown on civil society that's underway. And just to give you a sense, a lot of people think that Egypt has stabilized somewhat. The Nadim Center, which is a prominent human rights organization that's been here for over 20 years. Its doors were forced closed in February by security forces. They just put out a report documenting government abuses just in the month of March alone. This is just March alone. They found 177 killings, 37 cases of torture, 13 deaths in detention, 66 cases of medical negligence in prison, and 94 cases of enforced disappearance. So these are numbers that are hard to comprehend, but it really gives you a sense of the repressive climate that Egyptians are living in today. With regard to Sisi's meeting with Trump today, I think the significance is really more symbolic than anything else. Sisi is the first Arab leader to be received at the White House by President Trump. He was never invited under President Obama, and this is, of course, like the crown jewel of diplomacy to be at the White House. They only met once on the sidelines of a UN General Assembly in 2014. There's certainly a difference in rhetoric and tone with the Trump administration. Both leaders have expressed mutual admiration for each other and adopted a rhetoric that's devoid of any kind of criticism whatsoever. And also, yes, the White House has made clear that it won't make human rights a public point of contention, and they will discuss these matters behind closed doors. The Obama administration did at times offer muted criticism for human rights abuses or highlighted specific cases. However, I think it's very important to remember that while Sisi was presiding over this massive wave of repression, Obama did very little to alter the relationship between the United States and Egypt. Egypt, of course, is the second biggest recipient of military aid in the world from the United States, second only to Israel. After Morsi was ousted in 2013, after the massacre of nearly 1,000 of his supporters in August of that year, Obama did partially suspend the delivery of some weapon systems, F-16 warplanes, M1A1 Abrams tanks, Harpoon missiles, but he restored that aid in 2005. One thing he did cancel was something called cash flow financing, which basically allows Egypt to buy military equipment on credit. Only Egypt and Israel had that privilege, and that has been canceled. And that restoration of full military aid in 2015 comes despite official government acknowledgement of human rights abuses in Egypt. If you look at the congressionally mandated State Department report on human rights in 2015 or 2016, you'll see that they acknowledge security forces engage in unlawful killings, torture, enforced disappearances, arbitrary detention. They use all of these words. But the State Department has been regularly issuing what's called a national security waiver that allows Congress to override those concerns and continue the funding. And also, lastly, a report by the Government Accountability Office last May found that the U.S. government is not sufficiently vetting the sale of weapons to Egypt, so including weapons such as rubber-coated bullets and tear gas, which have been used and have killed peaceful protesters in Egypt. The State Department has not rejected a single case. The embassy vets thousands of individuals in the Egyptian security forces, and the State Department has not rejected a single one of them since 2013. These are the same police forces that have been accused of all these abuses. So this government accountability report. Go ahead.
Sharif, I wanted to ask you, in terms of the supposed cooperation between the Trump administration and Sisi in fighting the war on terror, to what degree is there a terrorist movement in Egypt, or is it really a resistance movement, an armed resistance movement against the Egyptian dictatorship? Because we're hearing reports of constant battles day to day between the Egyptian military and militants in the country.
Right. Well, I mean, Sisi's reason for being really, he launched himself on the war on terror, and we've really only seen more war and more terror in Egypt. There's a sustained insurgency in northern Sinai, with militants regularly attacking police and army positions. We've seen scores of civilians killed, hundreds of police and soldiers killed, as well as militants. The police use torture and curfews and airstrikes and military artillery attacks in northern Sinai. They have wiped out pretty much the town of Rafah to prevent, they said, smuggling of weapons from Gaza, where it borders. Despite all of that, These attacks continue. And in fact, an ISIS affiliate that has pledged allegiance to ISIS drove dozens of Christian families from their homes last month in Arish, in northern Sinai. They were forced to flee by a targeted campaign. And the attacks are not limited just to Sinai. We've seen multiple attacks in the mainland of Egypt, targeting police and security forces, police stations and so forth, but also targeting, for example, in December, a bomb ripped through Egypt's main Coptic cathedral, killing over 25 people. We've seen attacks on tourist sites with the ISIS affiliate claiming responsibility for the downing of a Russian airliner in 2015 that killed all 224 people on board. So, this increased militancy has been used as a justification for these harsh repressive measures. And this is kind of the same age-old authoritarian logic that just continues in a never-ending cycle.
Sharif, I wanted to ask you about the case of Aya Hijazi, the Egyptian-American citizen who's been detained by Egypt for over 1,000 days. Can you tell us who she is?
Aya Hijazi is a 30-year-old Egyptian-American who grew up in Falls Church and graduated from George Mason University. She returned to Egypt following the 2011 revolution. She got married to a man named Mohammed Hassanein. And with their wedding money, they founded something called the Beledi Foundation, where they work to educate and rehabilitate street children in Cairo. In May of 2014, amidst a broader crackdown on civil society, police forces raided the group without a judicial warrant. They arrested Aya and her husband and several others and charged them with a raft of very serious charges, including human trafficking, sexual exploitation of children, inciting children to participate in street protests, charges that carry a maximum of a life sentence. They've been in prison ever since. Human Rights Watch has called the case a travesty of justice. They've been in prison almost 3 years now, and that violates Egypt's own penal code, where detainees are only allowed to be held for 2 years under pretrial and provisional detention rules. There's been very frequent, prolonged postponements of the trial. They have not been allowed to meet with their lawyers privately. And I was at a session just a couple of weeks ago where the verdict was supposed to be heard. Aya was in the defendant's cage in the courtroom. Her husband came in. They embraced very tightly. They only see each other in the defendant's cage weeks or months apart. It was a very moving scene. And then the judge postponed the verdict inexplicably, as many postponements have occurred in this case, to April 16th. So we'll have to wait and see what happens. It's hard to know, but I very much doubt that Aya Hijazi will be a topic of conversation today between Trump and Sisi, and she'll be forgotten by the leaders of both the countries she's a citizen of.
And finally, Sharif, before we go, the whole issue of not raising human rights, as the Trump administration has said they will not do in this meeting, and the significance of Sisi for Trump, that he was the first person to call and accept his call to congratulate Trump on his election.
Well, like I said, I think the main difference in the relationship will be one of tone and rhetoric. I mean, they see in each other kindred spirits, that they both have a populist slant that brought them to power. They use authoritarian language and authoritarian tactics to enforce their policies. They both have very dark views of the Muslim Brotherhood and look to annihilate any and all opposition. And so, but I think it also begs the question of how much the actual U.S. relationship will change, because we have to realize that Obama before him echoed decades of U.S. policy towards Egypt, which prioritizes perceived national security interests over human rights and rule of law.
Sharif, we have to leave it there. Thank you so much. But we're going to do part 2 of our conversation and post it online. Sharif Quddus is Democracy Now's correspondent and Cairo Nation Institute fellow. Breaking news from Russia. At least 10 people have died in 2 bombings in the St. Petersburg this morning. And I'll be speaking this weekend, Friday in Denver, Saturday in Castlegar, British Columbia at Selkirk College. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.